Welcome to another episode of Mike's Big Marshall Folder Exploration Journey. And the knife we're talking about today, I'm going to say, probably wasn't designed with Marshall application in mind. It's also one of the shortest blades we've looked at so far in the series, yet somehow the third heaviest folder we've looked at so far. So yeah, absolutely a dense, chonky beast. And you know from the title, we're talking about the cold steel Formax Scout. Let's start as we usually do with the folded carry dimensions. And as I've already mentioned, this is a dense beast in pocket. A couple of quick visual comparisons, and yes, I'll go ahead and put up some side-by-side pictures. But all right, so 4-inch bladed Formax Scout compared to the 4.5-inch bladed Spartan. You can see that they are actually very similar in pocket in terms of length and width, and even we'll talk about thickness, but there's definitely a difference in weight that we'll get to. But while we're talking about 4-inch blades, what about compared to the 4-inch Voyager? Okay, the 4-inch Voyager is significantly smaller in terms of being, well, a little bit shorter, thinner front to back, and also slimmer, but significantly lighter. But while we're making comparisons, a little bit of a chuckle at my expense, early on in my channel, before I really knew what I was doing, I did a video, and I think I called it Big Cold Steel Folders or something like that. Now, this was before I did my big Marshall fixed blade exploration journey, and I've mentioned that spending all the time I have with the big fixed blades has really distorted my sense of proportion for what makes a big knife. But back when I made the video, I considered a 3.5-inch folder to be a big folder. And the biggest folder I had at the time was the AD-10. I considered this a massive chunky beast. Well, the next bigger folder I picked up was the Formax Scout, and it's taken me all this time to actually get around to reviewing the thing. So this is me making up for that. But yeah, the difference between these two in all specifications just blew me away. And obviously I've collected even bigger folders since then. But let's call this my first really kind of entry into big folders. How big and heavy are we talking? All right, well, let's talk about the build of the friendly end. It is kind of squarish. That's one complaint that's going to come up in handling. But you've got Grivex scales with a pretty coarse texture, very similar to what you see on the Raja 2, but I think it's a little coarser than that, and I feel like it does need to be smoothed out a little bit under the pocket clip because it does really grab the pants. Makes it hard to deploy, but it's not going anywhere. Really wide, solid pocket clip that I wish was blackened for visibility issues, but it actually carries reasonably low in the pocket compared to some of those other big folders we've been looking at. Now, under the scales, I need to make a quick correction. I've been assuming that a lot of the liners under the various plastic scales have been aluminum. And I think this is where I was getting a lot of the differences in weights of the different folders that were similar sizes. Some of the liners are aluminum and some are steel. The Raja 2 and the Spartan have steel liners, and so does this one. And they're full steel liners. They're not drilled out at all. It's got a very thick blade. We'll talk about that in the next section. You'll see some nice jimping on the back up here. Triad lock, and yeah, full aluminum backspacer. So, all right, specifications. Length, 6 inches, 15 centimeters. So again, not the longest we've looked at, but for a 4-inch blade, I'm going to consider that pretty long. Still fits in a back pocket just fine. Width front to back, 2 inches, 5 centimeters. Again, compared to some of the wide folders that we've looked at, that's in that range. But thickness, 16.5 millimeters. Okay, so the Spartan and the Raja 2 are a shade thicker than this. But pretty much all the other knives you've looked at are slimmer. What about the weight? 10.3 ounces, 292 grams. So not as heavy as the XL Espada. Well, I hope it isn't. Not as heavy as the Raja 2, but significantly heavier than the Spartan. And both of the large Espadas that I have, and a whole lot heavier than the similar size or even bigger Voyagers. So yeah, squarish, whitish, thickish, heavy in pocket. Let's talk about the blade specs, fit, finish, build quality. And the first number to throw out at you, I have not been putting links in the descriptions because the prices have been flexing, so shop around. Bought this knife a couple of years ago. This is me finally getting around to reviewing it. But just checked Amazon, and while I'm making the video, it's going for about 75 US dollars. Which, spoiler alert, I think for the money, that's a fantastic value for what you're getting. Well, what are you getting? Well, like a lot of the more affordable cold steel folders we've been looking at, AUS 10A steel that my test files are saying somewhere above 60 HRC. Flat saber grind, came with a stone wash finish, a lot of which is kind of polished off with use and such. Takes a lot of its design cues, as you can see, from the 3.5-inch bladed 8010. The drop point profile, the saber grind, and yeah, even that relief kind of swedge on the back, and we'll talk about that in performance. Same kind of choil. Love my choils that allow me to get real close to the bottom of the blade that crosses the line between the base of the blade and the grip, so that's awesome. Now, both knives also have some sizable jimping on the spines of the grip. It's interesting that the 8010, it's only in the liners, whereas it goes all the way across the triad on the Formax Scout, but the 8010 has some jimping grooves on the blade, whereas the Formax does not. Thumb stud opening, lockup. I've mentioned that sometimes these triad locks from the factory can be very inconsistent in terms of fit and finish. This one happened to be very smooth and locks up like a bank vault. Very solid knife, as we're going to see after the impact and durability tests. Now, okay, blade length, as mentioned, 4 inches, 10 centimeters. It's 1.5 inches wide, 3 3/4 centimeters. But the thickness, this is definitely playing into the weight. Thicker than a lot of the other sizable cold steel folders that we've looked at, nearly 5 millimeters thick. I'm going to call it 4.75 millimeters. How about that? Point of balance, talk about handling, is as usual pretty close to the top of that main finger groove, and your overall length is a pretty sizable 10 inches, 25 centimeters. Now, this is not the out-of-the-box edge. I've had this for a couple of years, used it for a lot of things. Actually, I've already run my impact and durability tests. I'll let you know how those went in a minute. But yeah, for a thick saber ground blade, it's pretty slicey. Holds a pretty good edge, easy to refresh. Haven't had to totally resharpen it with the use I put it to. Now, going through more resistant materials like cardboard, this is a big, thick, triple wall piece. Yeah, I'm getting some resistance as compared to some of the keener knives we've tested. But it's definitely a solid knife in hand. So let me go ahead and roll in the footage of my usual battery of tests, and we'll talk about how it did. So how'd it do? First off, my usual caveat, these are not extended bushcrafting tests, but a lot of YouTubers have put this knife through those tests and it is performed impressively. Cold Steel themselves will happily demonstrate it's potentially more durable than a similar fixed blade knife. Tests I put together basically are to give me a sense of how the edge and the build hold together under pressure and impact and how they translate that pressure and impact back into my delicate hands. And in that latter aspect is where I think this design kind of fell down for me. Not just the squarish of the grips, but some of the corners. I could definitely feel it bite me doing certain things. Starting with stabbing and thrusting into my Pell stab 'em. Arguably the most martial test. Stab 'em is multiple layers of thick cardboard backed up by a couple of inches of compressed brown paper bag paper backed up by wood, using forward grip, reverse grip, and yeah, reversing the edge towards me as well. And performance was, well, not just as expected, maybe better than expected. Now, I've described my, shall we say, spectrum of tip geometries as running from hypodermic needle to shovel. Something that's maximized to penetrate the target with minimal resistance compared to something that's really kind of broad, makes an impressive channel into the media but doesn't penetrate very deeply, comparatively speaking, and I can really feel it imparting impact into the target when I stab and thrust. This is definitely more on the shovel end of the spectrum. But still, penetration, pretty impressive. Wound channel into the media, very impressive. However, not the most comfortable knife to do those things with. Wasn't slipping, but I was feeling the edges and the corners. So, yeah, not my favorite, but not horrible either. Did better than expected. Let's call it that. On to the potentially intentionally abusive bamboo test. Hacking and slashing, different angles, forward and reverse grip into a piece of hard bamboo to see if I can induce a chip or a roll or fragile edge. And like all my Cold Steel folders, this took no damage, no diminishment. And yeah, it's a chopper, spoiler alert for the next tests. Really bit into that hard media very impressively. Didn't feel too bad doing it, but yeah, I could start feeling some corners and edges and things like that. So not the most comfortable, but also not the least comfortable knife I've run through that test. Then on to carving and chopping. Now, as I mentioned, I picked this knife up a couple of years ago, and it was the biggest folder I had at the time, and I sort of had a Keanu Reeves whoa moment with it. Also felt it was kind of big and awkward for carry, so I put it to some use, but mostly it wound up in a drawer and stayed there. And here I am revisiting it as part of this series, giving it the attention I feel like it actually deserves. But I have used it to cut up some packaging, do some other utility tasks. It's not the best profile for getting through really thick cardboard, but you know, it's not useless at doing that. It's also not too bad for food prep. I'm going to make a lot of comparisons between this and other sizable drop point knives like my Becker BK2, which is a bigger, chonkier knife. But in certain ways, performance very similar between the two. I'll call this its little brother that I can actually fold up and take places that I can't take a fixed blade. So that's awesome. In the carving and chopping test, I'm using both a softer redwood and a harder whitewood, an ash board. And in carving and shaving, yeah, this is an awesome tool. Either gripped in what I'm going to call the standard grip or choked up close to the blade. Yeah, it was a pleasure to use and very effective. Not my most slicey tool for doing that, but pretty good and very durable. And not terribly uncomfortable either. Again, I'm feeling some corners. But, okay, chopping. Now, when it came to chopping, I did go ahead and choke all the way down, locking my hand into the flare. The pommel moves my hand down below the point of balance to give me maximum impetus in that blade, and it is a chopping machine. Held up very well, nothing got loose. Yeah, penetration into the wood was really nice. Again, very similar to, well, something like this, but smaller. However, that's where I really started feeling the corners, especially right down here for whatever reason. The more I did it, the more it bit into my hands and the less comfortable it got and the less I wanted to continue. So I'm thinking though, maybe I could do a little bit of rounding in just a couple of places and, well, fix that significantly. It's a potential to be continued. But, okay, a couple of other things that didn't wind up on camera. Batoning with the thing. Okay, it's kind of a short blade. But you can do it. You can use it that way. It's certainly going to hold up to that impact, but, okay, I feel like there's a couple of drawbacks in the design. Having this relief cut swedge in the back of it doesn't do it any favors if you're going to try to baton with it, because that is enough of an angle that it's going to chew up your baton. If you try to hit it in the place where there's no swedge up here towards the tip, well, that's sloped forward and your baton, well, it kind of glances off. And actually, kind of a funny aside, if you're a fan of the Dutch bushcraft guys, I think it was specifically with this knife when they were trying to baton with it, they scared themselves right out of the gate because the lock seemed to fail, but what they had done is they struck the baton right on the lock and disengaged it, and the knife folded in the middle of the batoning. They thought they broke it, but they had not. It was fine. This knife impressed them too, so there's that. Another minor shortcoming. The corners on it are, well, they're kind of rounded and polished. So I don't have a sharp corner available to effectively strike a ferro rod. So that's an interesting shortcoming, if it matters to you. But I think this knife does have a whole lot of potential as a sturdy, durable utility tool. Let's go ahead and talk about carry and Marshall handling. All right, it's time to go back down to the extra unflattering winter waistline view to talk about carry and deployment. And this is where I admit this is not a favorite knife for me for carry. Now, it's not too big to carry in a pocket lengthwise, but it is, well, you certainly have knives that are more pocket filling in terms of width front to back. It is a bit thick and it is a bit square. Also, a couple of things, the texture of the grip. It's not necessarily rippy on the pants, but I feel like it needs a little bit of smoothness under the clip because, as you're going to see, it really does hang on tight, and for me it can be a struggle to get it in and out of my pocket. Also, yeah, you don't have a whole lot exposed. We're going to take a look at that in a minute, but that is a big, wide, shiny pocket clip. So, certainly not too big to stick in a back pants pocket, but it does look like a sizable tool in my back pocket. And yeah, the weight does definitely drag down on the pants, and when I go to deploy it, I don't have a lot of real estate to grab onto, so I do have to go digging for it a bit. And yeah, it really does not want to let go of my pants. I'm probably going to have to smooth that out. What about the front pocket? Okay, kind of same. I feel like maybe it's a little less obtrusive, but I am feeling this thickness and the squareness of it in my pockets as I move around. Still have that visibility issue. It is a little bit easier for me to reach into my front pocket and grab a hold of it, but yeah, it really hates letting go of my pants. I'm going to have to do something about that. Now, it doesn't have any kind of hook or thumb plate for that kind of out-of-pocket deployment. Also, for me, these shorter knives, I'm no good at shaking them open, which means, yeah, I'm going to have to shift my grip up far enough that I can get to the thumb stud and just deploy it conventionally. Before we talk about Marshall handling, a couple of things real quick. I did take the opportunity to round off all the unfriendly squarish corners. Thankfully, Gribex is really workable with files and sandpaper. While I was at it, I also sanded under the pocket clip a little bit to help it release from my pants. Repeated my impact and durability tests really quick, and yeah, it feels a whole lot better now. In fact, the only real hot spot I'm getting, I think it's because that blade stock is so thick, it's the gap here, combined with those sharpish metal liners, but I feel like that's sort of the price of having a knife I can fold up and carry in my pocket as compared to a fixed blade. But how does it kind of fit with the driving philosophy of the series? based on the wisdom of Jorge Prina about what makes the best Marshall knife for you. Not only the one you have on you when you need it, and I hope you never need it for that, but the one that you carry the most and use the most for the most things, which means you're more likely to be carrying it and you're going to be comfortable and familiar with it. Does it have the balance between utility and Marshall application? Well, I think we need to talk about the balance of its utility use. The things it does well, it does really, really well. It's kind of maximized for that. But other utility uses for me, I have, well, more favorite designs. If you happen to like a big, stout, drop point fieldcraft, bushcraft knife, you're probably going to love this option. But even in that, as I mentioned, a couple of drawbacks, the roundish corners and that swedge on the back not helping it. All right, speaking of, I feel like needs to be a comparison made. When we're talking about stout bladed 4-inch cold steel folders between this and the SR1. So stay tuned for that. But for me, the SR1, I prefer it because, well, not only is it slimmer and lighter for carry, but I also, well, I think I like the blade geometry more overall. And yeah, has some nice sharp edges on the back to strike a ferro rod, and I could potentially baton better with it too if I was going to use it for that. But that's a to be continued. Back to this one, though. All right, when it comes to Marshall handling, again, kind of lopsided. Grip feels great. Thrusting and stabbing, though, as I mentioned, definitely more shovel than needle. So it might not be very effective in penetration depending on target media, layers of target media. But it's going to hit hard. You can certainly use it for that if you needed to use it for that. So it'll be the best for it in terms of penetration. But what it can do, it's going to do reasonably impressively, and it's sturdy enough to do that. Plus, I forgot to mention, there's also, I don't know if there'd ever be a use for this situation where you'd need it, but there's actually a hole you could stick a metal pin in there for extra security to keep it from accidentally failing and closing on you. I just can't imagine what you'd have to do to make that happen. But all right, one thing it does for me pretty well is what it does in utility is chopping. So chopping actions, the way this hits, and also being able to use the belly for slashing. And yeah, it rocks in my hand really nicely for snap cuts, so I can make good use out of that. Now, shortcomings, doesn't have any kind of a swept back point at all, so I don't feel like I can get any back cutting actions. While it does have a massive blade, it's not terribly long. Yes, if I choke all the way down, I can get an extra 1.5 inches of functional blade reach out of it. But for me, that's not quite enough to feel like I can get much out of a flat strike or a spine strike, and certainly no parrying with it. So my tactics are going to be more evasive, countercut, counter thrust, and rely on what's going on in my other hand. What about reversing the edge towards me? This is where we need to talk about this particular curved geometry of the build. We'll talk about it also in reverse grip. But one thing to note, the way this is kind of curved forward, it really does help me line up the blade straight in my hand, not only for utility use, but for thrusting. If I reverse the edge towards me, you're going to notice with my wrist in a pretty neutral position, it puts the blade at a very right angle to my forearm, which is great for getting around corners or upwards, and then you get some good cutting action going into the target media. So yeah, there's usefulness there. And it doesn't feel too bad in this grip. That finger groove doesn't really get in my way and make much of a hot spot. But what about reverse grip? Which means we have to talk about transitions. Now when it comes to pinch flipping, I am running into this corner just a little bit, but not much. However, the texture of the grip and the lack of any other barriers to my stubby fingers make pinch flipping pretty nice. The weight and the balance of the knife actually sort of assists it. So yeah, that's not bad at all. Now, I could do the safe, sane thing and just transition it in two hands. Or, if you guys have been following the channel, you know we got to talk about finger twirling, which I don't recommend because it's not very safe or secure. Kids don't try it at home. but it's something I've been doing for decades, so it's a reflex I fall back on. And yeah, I can do it. It's slim enough and grippy enough. It's a little chonky between my fingers, but it's just not bad at all for finger twirling. And what finger twirling does for me, why I keep doing it, is it's quick, and it does keep the edge always facing the same direction. So if I started with the edge facing away from me, in the reverse grip, it settles into edge facing away from me, as compared to pinch flipping where I have to reverse it, correct it. And in the reverse grip, that curvature comes back again. In kind of a neutral wrist position, you'll notice in edge away from me, blade very much at right angles to my arm, which is very nice for stabbing. Again, maybe not the best at penetration, but that's going to hit hard and you can make that work well. Also, good belly forward for slashing actions. Maybe not as good as some of those swept forward belly clip points or kukri style blades we've been looking at, but yeah, I can certainly make good use of that. But okay, turning the edge towards me, that curve, we've seen this in other designs, is really working against me. Curving it, I feel way too back towards me. I really have to contort my wrist. I could make use of it in a pinch if I happen to pick it up this way, but it wouldn't be my preference. It does give me some back cutting action, but yeah, I've been using this phrase a lot in the series. It feels as awkward as it looks. Can I use the butt end as an impact tool? Yeah, it actually has some nice reinforcement and some nice angles to maximize impact, and yeah, I can also use it for that in the forward grip. So there's some options for you. The grip, like I said, is very secure, and now that I've rounded things, it's very comfortable for me. But there is an unbalance to this knife, where even in utility use, it's definitely focused on certain applications more than others. And in martial use, yeah, certain things, therefore, I can make it do really well, and other things I'm going to favor, well, other designs. So let's get our conversation going. If you have this knife, also, there is the premium version. G10 scales and premium blade steel. If you happen to have one, let me know what you think of that. Maybe I'll add it to my wish list. Because I do actually really like this knife for what it does well. Probably not going to be my EDC, but I feel like it's a knife I, well, haven't given as much attention as I should have. But until our next episode, as always, thank you all so much for watching, liking the videos, subscribing, following my journey, and I hope to see you back for, should it be the SR1 Lite?